You've all seen those distressing pictures of starving children in Yemen or Somalia. And you might think, is it a curse? Is it ever possible to lift a country out of poverty? Or is there some bright hope somewhere? Are there some historical examples of countries that were once plagued by starvation, eventually emerging and becoming rich? Well, there are. Stay tuned as we explore the history of the Asian tigers. In a previous video, we studied patterns of wealth and poverty in the world today. That the GDP per capita can vary from around $500 or $1,000 a year in a poor country like Niger, all the way to $50,000 and above in a rich country like Norway. We've identified two kind of possible explanations. Either the legacy from the colonial era, or maybe bad governance in more recent times. So let's look at some historical examples, specifically in East Asia. And we'll focus today on three countries: Japan, South Korea, and China over the past 50 years or so. Those three countries shared similarities in the 40s and 50s in that they started from a pretty terrible situation. If you look at Japan, say in 1945, at the very end of World War II, the country was in ruins. It had had the bad idea of invading most of East Asia and then taking on the United States, among other enemies. And so by the spring of 1945, the US Air Force pretty much bombed Japan back into the Stone Age. We are familiar with the big bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August using nuclear bombs, but you also have firebombing of Tokyo and other places, conventional bombs as well. So pretty much every city that was 100,000 people or more was in ruins as of 1945. And you had even a situation where the population was very close to starvation, survived by hunting whales, among other things. So a low starting point there. The case of South Korea is also quite dramatic. Here's a country that was stuck between China and Japan, the two 800-pound gorillas in the neighborhood, and as a result has suffered quite a bit from the foreign dominations or outright colonization over the years. In the early 20th century, among other things, he was taken over as a protectorate and eventually annexed by Japan. And the Japanese treatment of Koreans was not always optimal. A famous case would involve a woman living in Korea in the 1930s and 40s, and that were forcibly recruited into the Japanese army to serve as prostitutes for the brothels for the Japanese army. These were called comfort women. The situation did not improve in the 40s and 50s because as part of the Cold War, the Korean peninsula was split in two, a bit like Germany or Vietnam. So the northern part of Korea would be within the Soviet sphere of influence with the communist dictator Kim Il-sung, and the southern part would be with the pro-American dictator Syngman Rhee. Korea itself became a battleground for the Cold War in that from 1950 to 1953, a major conflict broke out, the Korean War. The war was a destructive one because when the North Koreans attacked, they went all the way to Busan in the south before being pushed out by a US counteroffensive all the way to the Yalu River in the north, and then the Chinese intervened and pushed American forces all the way to the middle of the peninsula, and as armies went back and forth, entire cities were wiped out. I don't have the exact figures in my mind right now, but roughly 1 million civilians died in the north and 1 million civilians in the south. All of that for, well, a war that didn't achieve much, and the borders were back where they started. So a city like Seoul, the capital of South Korea, looked like this at the end of the war. And worse, the major resources like iron ore or coal would be located in the northern part of Korea. So not a good starting point. And as of 1953, when the Korean War ended, the GDP per capita in South Korea was equivalent to the GDP per capita in North Korea and equivalent to the GDP per capita in Haiti. So that things didn't look so bright. So we know that in the future, the GDP per capita in South Korea eventually skyrocketed, that of North Korea did not, and that of Haiti did not. But that was not expected as of 1953. The third country I want to focus on today would be China, and also it had its share of hurdles to overcome. It has more natural resources than Japan or South Korea, but it had quite a few disasters that befell it in the 20th century, and we have a whole video about that. I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version of that. First, in the early 20th century, he was in the dying years of the Manchu dynasty. Then in 1911, a major revolution broke out that brought an end to the period of the empire of the emperors of China. And then that was followed by a long civil war between the nationalists of Jiang Jiexi and the communists of Mao Zedong. As if that was not enough, in the 1930s, China was invaded by Japan. That included Manchuria, later cities like Shanghai or Nanking, where tremendous atrocities were committed against the Chinese population. And then when World War II ended in 1945, the country went back to a civil war between nationalists and communists until 1949, when the communists won. And that's just the beginning, because the communist rule was marked by the atrocities committed by Mao Zedong. Most famously, in the late 1950s, he tried to develop the steel industry through what is known as the Great Leap Forward, which turned out to be a major catastrophe, resulting in the deaths through starvation of about 50 million people. So there again, in the 1950s, was one country that didn't seem exactly poised for success. And yet, all three countries somehow succeeded. So what happened there? Well, there is a kind of a model that those countries could follow, and that model was from Japan in the late 19th century, the model of the Meiji era. Again, I have another video about that period, so I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version of that. The Meiji era is named after the emperor, Mutsuhito, aka Meiji, who ruled from 1867 forward. And he decided that he would modernize Japan, in part by westernizing, by learning from, in a way, his enemies, his rivals in Europe and North America. So that would mean opening the Japanese economy to foreign trade, which they had been very reluctant to do before, focusing on export goods, like say textile or light manufacturing, inviting foreign experts to come, German chemists, British management experts, and creating private companies along the capitalist model with a little tweak, in the sense that they would get substantial backing from the state at crucial moments, maybe favorable loans, favorable government contracts, or the like. Those private companies that would receive aid from the government would be known as zaibatsu in Japanese. And that was a great success, in that the Japanese economy was the only one that took off economically in the late 19th century. So much so, in fact, that they had the bad idea in the 1920s and 1930s of using that newfound wealth to finance a war of expansion in Asia and eventually against the US. But you see, there is kind of a pattern there that could be exploited by later countries. So how do you develop your economies then? There are different options. In the class, we've studied some communist models of development, though from Russia to China to Cuba, they tended to be a failure and also result in great human rights catastrophes. Or you might promote foreign aid as a support for development, though usually that has not been too successful in countries like, say, Haiti. Or you might rely on natural resources, and that's what people in the Persian Gulf have done, or in the Congo, but it doesn't always work too well. On top of that, South Korea and Japan have very few natural resources, so not an option. Those countries decided to borrow from the Meiji era and have more of an export-based capitalist kind of development. To do exports, what you need to do according to classical economic theory, going back to David Ricardo or Adam Smith, is to specialize in the one product that you're particularly good at. Economists call that having a comparative advantage. For poor countries with little in the way of natural resources, what is your comparative advantage? If you're in South Korea and you have a large poor population in the 1950s. Well, that's it. That's your comparative advantage. A large poor population, meaning you have plenty of laborers working at a very low wage. And that doesn't sound too exciting, but you could use that for some sectors like light industry, textile manufacturing, simple electronics. And whether it's Japan early on, or later on South Korea, or even more recently China, all these countries started off with light industry. Taiwan or South Korea would be known in the 70s or 80s for making cheap plastic watches, for example. Or China in the 80s and 90s for making cheap plastic toys for Walmart. And now the name of Japan is associated more with quality, but if you go back in time, it was also exporting cheap products early on in its economic development. That's not the most exciting period of development, because you're talking sweatshops, essentially, people willing to work 10, 20, 30 cents an hour for making, say, jeans manufacturing. But that's pretty much the only thing you can do early on. An industry that requires little in the way of capital investment because you have little money, so the sweatshops would just require a few sewing machines, and require little in the way of skill because your population is not skilled. So the one thing you have going for you, the one thing where you can compete with richer, more advanced countries like the US, pick some labor-intensive product like making jeans together, where the vast bulk of the cost is salary, and that's the area where you are good at. This will last for maybe a generation, and hopefully the next generation will be able to have a life that is a bit better. Because the parents had somewhat of a salary, the next generation might get more training, and so they might go all the way to, I don't know, trade school and so forth, and they'll be welders instead of just being people who sew jeans together. And the capital of the country will also accumulate because after a generation of growth, you have some money to invest, in which case you can graduate to what is more like heavy manufacturing, by which I mean steel mills, shipyards, car manufacturing, and the like. This would require far more capital to set up a whole shipyard. It's way, way more expensive than just a few sewing machines in a sweatshop. But in that second generation, you have now more capital. It also requires more skills. To set up a ship requires welders and engineers that might not have existed early on when all you had were people willing to sew jeans together. So it's only kind of a second stage of the rocket, so to speak, once you have reached that level of development. The good thing about it is that the amount of money involved is much, much greater. The profit margin will be higher. So you'll go from people that are making, I don't know, $1 an hour to people that might be making $10 an hour. It's a second level of development. And you have quite a few shipyards in Japan, South Korea, or Singapore today. The third level of development might be another generation after that. Once you have people that not only have gone to trade school, but maybe have a whole engineering degree or graduated from college and can do far more skilled jobs. The amount of capital that is also invested is now much greater because you have two generations of growth and you can invest more. Companies are also richer. Those companies might be modeled after the zaibatsu of Japan. The Koreans call that a chaebol, C-H-A-E-B-O-L, which is the same kind of thing, but in South Korea. A large company, a conglomerate that will have a hand in different things, from shipyards to maybe electronics. So the name of those companies might be familiar to you, sake of Daewoo and Samsung for South Korea, or maybe Mitsubishi or Toyota for Japan. In that third phase of the industry, you can now do things that are more advanced, advanced electronics, like say Sony PlayStations or Sega, or maybe Samsung phones, things that require a lot of investments to put together, a lot of R&D. Companies, the factories cost a lot of money to produce, and also require a lot of engineering expertise to make computer chips, which is kind of the big industry in Taiwan, would require a lot of money. But the profit margins will be much, much greater. So now you go from $10 an hour as a salary to maybe $100 an hour. Or you might branch out into more like the service industry, anything from K-pop to Japanese manga to anything else that you can think of. Historically, the first country to undergo that transformation would be Japan, first during the Meiji era and then immediately after World War II. And then the next phase of countries to kind of go through that three-step process would be the so-called Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, or Hong Kong. In that case, tigers does not refer to any kind of endangered species. It would be more like the roaring economies of East Asia. And when those were successful, others tried to follow suit, specifically China, which up until 1976, the year of the death of Mao Zedong, kind of stuck to a communist system that had not succeeded too well. But there were important reforms set up in the 1980s by their leader at the time, Deng Xiaoping, who kind of kept the dictatorship aspect of communism, and China is still a dictatorship, but then switched its economic practices to something much closer to capitalism, where you allow private enterprise and you open yourself to trade, you join the World Trade Organization, and then you embrace an export-based development that seemed to have succeeded so well in South Korea and elsewhere. And that's where from the 1980s forward, China took off economically so fast. First in light, cheap manufacturing, more like the sweatshop environment, then towards more heavy industry, say making solar panels and such, and now trying to gravitate toward more high-tech stuff, making airplanes of their own and the like. And also the same type of capitalism where you have free enterprise, but some favored companies receive a lot of backing from the state, which leads to complaints from, say, the US that the Chinese are not always playing fair. Maybe something close to crony capitalism, you might call that true as well in South Korea and to some extent Japan. Result is incredible. China in the late 50s was known as the place where kids were starving to death. And now if you think of China today, you're thinking, well, that kid is going to steal my job. So now we know how countries can take off economically. The issue is, do they do that within a framework that is democratic or not? Well, historically, the Asian tigers tended to take off within the concept of a more enlightened dictatorship, if you will. During the initial takeoff in the 1860s, Japan would be ruled by the Meiji Emperor. And then in the 1950s, 60s, Korea, Taiwan tended to be ruled by dictatorships, Syngman Rhee in South Korea, for example. And that is still the case in places like, say, Singapore, that tend to be held with a firm hand. And as far as China in recent years, well, it has been still ruled by a communist dictatorship. So what happens though as the economy progresses and takes off? As a middle class gets bigger, more educated, and then might want to get more freedoms for itself. Because if you have illiterate peasants that arrive in the big city and work long hours in a sweatshop, you could see as a dictator it's fairly easy to keep a lid on their aspirations. If it's 1 or 2 generations later, and these are people that went to college, studied engineering, read the paper every day, have access to the internet, maybe they want something more. Maybe they want to have a say in their government, and there will be pressure to democratize. And that's what happened. Japan, the first country to undergo that economic takeoff, was also the first to democratize in the region. In part because Japan was defeated after World War II, occupied by the US, and the US General Douglas MacArthur imposed a constitution, which is still the constitution of Japan, where the emperor remained in power, but only as a figurehead, and then you would have democratic election, a parliament that is called the Diet, and then a prime minister that is representative before parliament, kind of what you have in Britain, a system of a constitutional monarchy. South Korea, Taiwan, that were part of the second wave of economic takeoff, 50s, 60s, 70s, went through that democratic transition more in the 1980s, where you have a lot of popular pressures to adopt a more democratic system of government, and that's still the case today. And it's a kind of a lively democracy. I don't know if you've ever been on YouTube to watch videos of parliamentary debates in South Korea or Taiwan. Much more fun than you think. Oftentimes they have a tendency to erupt into brawls. So a lively democracy. And the great question of our time is whether China, now that it's part of that third wave of countries taking off, whether China will eventually get to the point where it will democratize as well. Obviously, the Chinese dictators do not want that to happen. What they're trying to do is a kind of a compact with their people, where as long as economic growth is still 5–10% a year, people get richer every year, and then they accept a lack of human rights. If economic growth ever slows down, then you might have more revolts and so forth. There was already a pretty close call in 1989, where on Tiananmen Square, which is a big square in the middle of Beijing, the capital, students led some massive demonstrations that lasted 4 weeks, and the art students in the crowd set up a Statue of Liberty, and all was very exciting. I remember watching that on TV when I was a kid. Maybe China will democratize. Except eventually the Chinese army had a major crackdown. The one picture that is famous from that period is that of one man that stood before a whole line of tanks that were on their way to Tiananmen Square, and then stopped them dead in their tracks, literally. Well, that's a heartwarming picture, but it's more the exception than the reality. The reality is that many other tanks got to the square and then destroyed that square and the people that lived on it. And that's kind of the reality, even in the day of the internet, that China is trying to limit access to information. If you were in China and Googling Tiananmen Square massacre, those photos would not pop up. All of that would be heavily censored, and you have thousands of people in China whose sole job is to go into chat rooms and see what people are talking about and closing down websites if they dare to talk about sensitive topics like, number one, Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. Number two, the situation of Tibet. This is a province in Western China that used to be its own kingdom in the 1950s. The Dalai Lama, the head of the Buddhist religion, was its king. And then under Mao Zedong, the province was, well, the kingdom was overrun by the Chinese army and then incorporated as a province of China, which it still is today. And so you have plenty of protests against that, which include in some cases Buddhist monks going to Tiananmen Square to immolate themselves as a form of nonviolent protest against the Chinese occupation. That's another topic that you will not see discussed in chat rooms on the national press in China. So if I had to make a guess, and it's very, very dangerous as a historian, maybe looking into the future, China will kind of follow the lead that South Korea or Taiwan, and before that Japan followed, which is as the population gets richer, it also becomes more democratic. So that's it about those countries. It's a pretty short video today because things go well. In history, when you study bad stuff, there's a lot to say about war and such. And that's usually my stock in trade: war, famine, and pestilence. But every once in a while, you have some nice success stories where people get richer and fatter and happier, and billions of people are lifted out of poverty. That also means that history is not always a curse. You can escape from your past. And that pains me to say that because I study the past to see how it influences the present, but it doesn't always. Countries like China, South Korea, Japan that were on the verge of starvation in the 40s and 50s are now per capita, especially for Japan or South Korea, among the richest in the world. So things can be looking up. That's the beautiful story from today. Next time we'll move on to a less savory story, and that will be the case of the Congo, one country that did poorly despite having a wealth of natural resources. Stay tuned.